Good morning, boys and girls. How are you today? I hope you're well. So, I'm going to start reading Harry Potter today for you, just so you can have a listen, just like we do at school during quiet time, where you can just listen to the story. Okay, but I have to tell you, I'm going to start from the beginning again. So I think that will be okay. Some people might not have heard it from the beginning. So you're just going to listen to me read for about 20 minutes. How about that? Okay, are you ready to listen? Let's go. All right. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal. Thank you very much. They were the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. Mr. Dursley was the director of a firm called Grunnings, and that made drills. He was a big, beefy man with not much neck, although he did have a very large moustache. Mrs. Dursley was thin and blonde and had nearly twice the amount of normal neck, which came in very useful as she spent much of her time craning over garden fences. That means looking over the fences, and she was spying on her neighbours. The Dursleys had a small boy called Dudley, and in their opinion there was no finer boy anywhere. The Dursleys had everything they wanted, but they also had a secret, and their greatest fear was that somebody would discover it. They didn't think they could bear it if anybody found out about the Potters. Mrs. Potter was Mrs. Dursley's sister, but they hadn't met for several years. In fact, Mrs. Dursley pretended she didn't have a sister at all, because her sister and her good-for-nothing husband were as un-Dursleyish as it was possible to be. The Dursleys shuddered to think what the neighbours would say if the Potters arrived in their street. The Dursleys knew that the Potters had a small son too, but they had never seen him. Thus, this boy was another good reason for keeping the Potters far away. They didn't want Dudley mixing with a child like that. When Mr. and Mrs. Dursley woke up on a very dull, very grey Tuesday morning, our story starts. There was nothing about the cloudy sky outside to suggest that a strange and mysterious things would be soon happening all over the country. Mr. Dursley hummed as he picked out his most very boring tie for work, and Mrs. Dursley gossiped away happily as she wrestled a screaming Dudley into his high chair. None of them noticed a large, tawny owl flutter past the window. Imagine, how would you feel if you saw a big owl going past your window in the morning? At 8:30, Mr. Dursley picked up his briefcase, pecked Mrs. Dursley on the cheek, and tried to kiss Miss Dudley goodbye, but missed because Dudley was now having a tantrum and he was throwing his cereal at the walls. "Oh, little tyke," chortled Mr. Dursley as he left the house, and he got into his car and backed down of the driveway of number 4. It was on the corner of the first street that he noticed the first sign of something peculiar. Peculiar means something strange. It was a cat reading a map. That nearly rhymes, doesn't it? For a second, Mr. Dursley didn't realise what he had seen. Then he turned his head around quickly to look again. And there was a tabby cat standing on the corner of Privet Drive. But there wasn't a map in sight. What could he have been thinking? It must have been a trick of the light, he thought. Mr. Dursley blinked again and stared at the cat. And do you know what happened? The cat stared back. As Mr. Dursley drove around the corner and up the road he watched the cat in his mirror. It was now reading the sign that said Privet Drive. No, the cat was looking at the sign. Cats couldn't read maps or signs. How silly. Mr. Dursley gave himself a little shake and put the cat out of his mind. As he drove towards town, he thought of nothing except for a large order of drills he was hoping to get that day. That doesn't sound very interesting, does it? But on the edge of town, the drills were driven out of his mind by something else. As he sat in the usual morning traffic jam, he couldn't help noticing that there seemed to be a lot of strangely dressed people around. People in cloaks. Mr. Dursley couldn't bear people who dressed in funny clothes. The get-ups you saw on young people these days. Oh, he supposed this was some silly new fashion. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel and his eyes fell on a huddle of these weird people standing quite close by. They were whispering excitedly together, and Mr. Dursley was so angry to see that a couple of them weren't even young at all. Why, that man had to be older than he was, and he was wearing an emerald green cloak. The nerve of him! But then it struck Mr. Dursley that this was probably some silly stunt. These people were obviously collecting money for something. Yes, that must be it. The traffic moved on, and a few minutes later, Mr. Dursley arrived in the car park of Grunnings, with his mind firmly back on the drills. Mr. Dursley always sat with his back to the window in the office of the 9th floor, because if he hadn't, he might have found it harder to concentrate on the drills that morning. He didn't see the owls swooping past in broad daylight, though people down in the street did. They pointed and gazed open-mouthed as owl after owl sped overhead. Now, this is me again. Do you know when owls do fly around? Is it in the daytime or is it at night time? That's maybe why it was so strange, because owls fly around at night time, not in the daytime. So let's go again. Most of them had never seen an owl even at night time. Mr. Dursley, however, had a perfectly normal owl-free morning. He yelled at 5 different people, and he made several very important phone calls and shouted a little bit more. He was in a very good mood until lunchtime, when he thought he'd stretch his legs and walk across the road to buy himself a bun from the bakery. He had forgotten all about the people in cloaks until he passed a group of them next to the baker's. He eyed them angrily as he passed. He didn't know why, but they made him very uneasy. This bunch of people were whispering excitedly too. He couldn't see a single collecting tin. He was on his way back past them, clutching a large doughnut in a bag. Then he caught a few words of what they were saying. The Potters, that's right, that's what I heard. Yes, their son Harry. Mr. Dursley stopped, and fear flooded him. He looked back at the whisperers as if he wanted to say something, but he thought better of it. He dashed back across the road, hurried up to his office, and snapped at his secretary not to disturb him. He seized his telephone and had almost finished dialing his home number when he changed his mind. He put the receiver back down and stroked his moustache, thinking. No, he was being very silly. Potter wasn't such an unusual name. He was sure that there were lots of people called Potter who had a son called Harry. Come to think of it, He wasn't even sure his nephew was called Harry. He'd never even seen the boy. It might have been Harvey or Harold. There was no point worrying Mrs. Dursley. She always got so upset at any mention of her sister. He didn't blame her if he had had a sister like that. But all the same, those people in cloaks. He found it a lot harder to concentrate on Jill's that afternoon when he left the building at 5 o'clock. He was still so worried that he walked straight over into somebody just outside his door. "Sorry," he grunted as the tiny old man stumbled and almost fell. It was a few seconds before Mr. Dursley realised that the man was wearing a violet cloak. He didn't seem at all upset, and he said in a squeaky voice that made passers-by stare, "Oh, don't be worried. Don't be sorry, my dear sir, for nothing could upset me today. Rejoice, for you know who has gone at last. Even muggles like yourself should be celebrating this happy, happy day." The old man hugged Mr. Dursley around the middle and walked off. Mr. Dursley stood rooted to the spot. That means he couldn't move, he was so shocked. He had been hugged by a complete stranger. He also thought he'd been called a muggle, whatever that was, and he was rattled. He hurried to his car and set off for home, hoping he was imagining things which he had never hoped before, because he did not approve of imagination. As he pulled into the driveway of number 4, the first thing he saw, and this did not improve his mood, that was the tabby cat he'd spotted that morning. It was now sitting on his garden wall. He was sure it was the same one. It had the same lines around its eyes. "Oh, shoo!" said Mr. Dursley loudly. The cat did not move. It just gave him a very serious, stern look. Was this normal cat behaviour? Mr. Dursley wondered, trying to pull himself together. He let himself into the house. He was still determined not to mention anything to his wife. Mrs. Dursley had had a nice, normal day. She told him over dinner all about Mrs. Next Door's problems with her daughter and how Dudley had learnt a new word, shan't. Mr. Dursley tried to act very normally. When Dudley had been put to bed, he went into the living room in time to catch the last report of the evening news. And finally, bird watchers everywhere have been reporting that the nation's owls have been behaving very unusually today. Although owls normally hunt at night and are hardly ever seen in the day, there have been hundreds of sightings of these birds flying in every direction since sunrise. Experts are unable to explain why the owls have suddenly changed their sleeping patterns. The newscaster allowed himself a grin. Most serious. "And now, over to Jim McGuffin for the weather. Going to be any more showers of owls tonight, Jim?" "Well, Ted," said the weatherman, "I don't know about that, but it's not only the owls that have been acting oddly today. Viewers as far apart as Kent, Yorkshire and Dundee have been phoning in to tell me that instead of the rain I promised yesterday, there has been a downpour of shooting stars. Perhaps people should have been celebrating bonfire night early. It's not until next week, folks, but I can promise a wet night tonight." Mr. Dursley sat frozen in his armchair. Shooting stars all over Britain? Owls flying by daylight? Mysterious people in cloaks all over the place? And a whisper about the Potters. Mrs. Dursley came into the living room and carried up 2 cups of tea. It was no good. He'd have to say something to her. He cleared his throat nervously. Petunia, dear, you haven't heard from your sister lately, have you? As he had expected, Mrs. Dursley looked shocked and angry. After all, they normally pretended that she did not have a sister. No, she said sharply. Why? Funny news on funny stuff on the news, Mr. Dursley mumbled. Owls, shooting stars, and there were a lot of funny-looking people around in the town today. So, snapped Mrs. Dursley. Well, I just thought maybe it was something to do with, her crowd. Mrs. Dursley sipped her tea through pursed lips. Mr. Dursley wondered whether he dared tell her he'd heard the name Potter. He decided he didn't dare. Instead, he said, as casually as he could, their son, he'd be about Dudley's age now, wouldn't he? I suppose so, Mrs. Dursley said stiffly. What was his name again? Howard, isn't it? Harry. Nasty, common name, if you ask me. Oh, yes, said Mr. Dursley, his heart sinking horribly. Oh, yes, I quite agree. He didn't say another word on the subject as they went upstairs to bed. When Mrs. Dursley was in the bathroom, Mr. Dursley crept to the bedroom window and peered down into the front garden. That cat was still there. It was staring down Privet Drive as though it was waiting for something. Was he imagining things? Could all this have anything to do with the Potters? And if it did, if it got out that they were related to a pair of, well, he couldn't bear to think about it. The Dursleys got into bed, and Mrs. Dursley fell asleep quickly. But Mr. Dursley lay awake, turning it all over in his mind. His last comforting thought before he fell asleep was that even if the Potters were involved, there was no reason for them to come near him and Mrs. Dursley. The Potters knew very well that he and Petunia thought about them and their kind. He couldn't see how he and Petunia could get mixed up in anything that might be going on. Oh, he yawned and turned over. It couldn't affect them. How very wrong he was. Mr. Dursley might have been drifting into an uneasy sleep, but the cat on the wall outside was showing no signs of sleepiness. It was still sitting as still as a statue, its eyes fixed unblinkingly on the far corner of Privet Drive. It didn't do so much as quiver when a car door slammed down the next street, nor when 2 owls swooped overhead. In fact, it was nearly midnight before the cat moved at all. A man appeared on the corner the cat had been watching. Appeared so suddenly and so silently, you'd have thought he just popped up out of the ground. The cat's tail twitched and its eyes narrowed. Boys and girls, I'm going to stop there. I've marked where I've finished, and then I'm going to continue tomorrow. So we've nearly gotten through the first chapter. Did you like it? I know you've heard it before, but we need to start from the beginning, okay? And then tomorrow, or maybe not tomorrow, and another time, I'll read the following part, okay? It was lovely to chat to and read to you, and I look forward to doing the next one, okay? Be safe, everybody. Be kind, okay? And I'll see you soon. Bye, everybody.